So just quickly, what kind of how this will work and what today is and isn't. Um, Tom and Gemma first, the two authors, are going to kind of start off by giving you a bit of a taster about what the book's about and a bit about what's in it, and then Fozia, our colleague, will then sort of reflect on kind of some wider issues and challenges with reforming grant making and how we can collectively make grant making better. And just to point out that this book, although it has the word grant in it, it's really about the process of, or the art of making grants and doing it well. So this isn't a book about how to raise more money or how to get money for your own particular cause. It's about how we can make the system of funding for charities better. So I think it's aimed very much at kind of practitioners and people who work in foundations or maybe trustees of foundations, but I think it also will be of interest to you if you're on the other side of the fence. Maybe you're a trust fundraiser or you run a charity. It's still going to be of interest to you, even though that's kind of not the absolute target audience of the book. So this is the book. I've held the book up. There are authors and panelists today, and if you do wish to purchase the book, it's available from DSC at the very low price of $15.99, which I think is actually a bargain. You can make your own judgment after the end. And there's a web link that's shortened there for you to kind of get to that information. We're recording this Zoom talk because we want others to get benefit from it. So just be aware of that. And if you don't want to be identified in any way, but you want to make a comment, you can tick the box that says anonymous if you're making a comment and your name won't show up. And if we're referring to that question in the discussion, you won't be sort of identified. We'd ask that you please use the Q&A function to post questions for the panelists as we get into the second part of the event, and use the chat if you have any more technical questions, like, you know, how does this or that work, or how do I post a question? And just finally, we really value your feedback. We'll have a survey at the end of the event today to hear from you about how you felt it was. Okay, so that's me. That's the introduction over, and I will now turn over to our authors, who are going to just briefly introduce themselves and talk about the book first.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Gemma. Really happy to be here with you today. So thanks, DSE, for inviting us, and thanks, Jay, for hosting and that really fab introduction. Before we go any further, just very, very quickly, who are Tom and I? Tom and I met working as executives at the National Lottery Community Fund, although we've both moved on since then. But before we were grant makers, we spent a long time as non-profit leaders in the UK's charity sector, which means that we've seen grant making from both sides of the table, and that we have no illusions about grant making's ups and sort of grant making's downs. About 2 years ago, we decided to try and write a book specifically for people employed as grant makers, instead of a book aimed at influencing philanthropists or even really board members. Now that we know that probably a lot of you on the Zoom link today will be grant seekers and grantees, not just grant makers. We're really delighted that you're here and hope, as Jay said, that you will find what we're about to share sort of interesting, useful, to learn a bit more about not just what goes on inside grant making, but the different reform movements and the way that grant making is being sort of pushed at the moment from both the outside and the inside. But again, a reminder for anybody that's just joined, our book isn't about how to win more grants. Sorry, but DSE can help on that front, but they've got loads of materials and books, you know, if you head on over to the website. So anyway, this book, it's called Modern Grant Making, a guide for funders who believe better is possible, and it was published a couple of months ago.
Hello, I'm Tom. I'm the co-author, the name that comes after Gemma's name on the front of the book. And I'm also delighted to be here. Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Fozia, so much for coming. I'm really looking forward to hearing Fozia in a minute, because her podcasts over the last couple of years are a big inspiration to bits of the book, which she may not even know. And so it's delightful to be on the call with her today. So, so the most important thing to explain about Modern Grant Making as a book is that it's actually two really separate things in one book. So first, it's an intensely practical guide to the sort of problems that grant makers face all the time. So how do I get my board to do anything? How do I improve that really rubbish application form that we make our applicants fill in? How do I rewrite my strategy, which I've been told to do? There's tons of intensely practical stuff, like lots of it, including a whole chapter on what we call no-brainers or grant-making no-brainers, which are just really simple things that grant makers should do all the time, like paying people quickly. So that's one thing. It's a guidebook. But it's also something else in disguise. It's a second thing. Modern grant making is an unashamed rallying cry for grant making reformers, and especially reformers who are employed by grant making organizations themselves. And it's a book that encourages everyone who works in grant making, whether they're really like senior or really, really junior, to acknowledge that it's a sector that really needs reform. Like all is not kind of well in the state of Denmark, as it were, and that it encourages people to see themselves not just as administrators inside a machine, but reformers, people who have agency in making their organization and the sector better, which it really needs to be. And so because the book is a kind of reforming rallying cry, it talks quite a lot about the sins and failures of traditional grant making, but it's not all negative. It also celebrates dozens of initiatives in different countries that are driven by grant makers who have shown through their acts and their deeds that they know that you can do better and that you don't have to live with how things are before. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, well, look, that's all very well, but what do you actually mean by these words, modern grant making? It's like written on the front. Is it code for some other thing? Is it maybe a rebranding of an idea like participatory grant making, or maybe effective altruism, which was very cool about 5 years ago? Or maybe it's just words that mean anti-racist grant making, or maybe it's something else. But in fact, our definition of modern grant making is not advocating a single practice or a single issue or a single value that really matters. Instead, we argue, and the words mean that grant making can just be done better if it's based on certain values. And specifically, we argue that modern grant making, this is our definition, is grant making that embodies 5 values. And these values are the values of humility, equity, evidence, service, and diligence. And in the rest of our opening here, me and Gemma are going to briefly talk about all 5 of these values and what they mean when made really concrete.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So the first value that we sort of put front and center in the book is humility. So to us, humility in grant making means entering every conversation with an assumption that you're no better or wiser than the other person that you're engaging with, whether that's opposite side of the table, other side of a Zoom call. It means engaging in every conversation with a willingness to listen and adjust your views in response to what you hear. It's the opposite of arrogant grant making, where you assume that because you have the money, that you somehow must be smarter or better informed than the other person you're engaging with. Sometimes it feels like it's easier to give examples of arrogant or non-humble grant making than humble, as humility in grant making can often be a mistake that's avoided. For example, we heard of a story where a non-profit that ran a very successful face-to-face training scheme was repeatedly pushed by a funder that they were working with into building a large video-based online skills course, think YouTube, when the grantee strongly felt this wouldn't work, and they certainly shared those views. But they were badgered and badgered and badgered, so decided to sort of do that in the end. And after a couple of years, they were proved right. The scheme didn't work well at all. So for us, this is an example of a choice by a funder to push the grantee into doing something that they didn't want to do. And it demonstrates what grant making can look like when humility is missing.
And so that's what grant making can look like when humility is not there. But we have a recent example of what it looks like when it is there. So some of you might have heard of the very high-profile US philanthropist and billionaire Mackenzie Scott, who has made a name recently making massive grants to a lot of US nonprofits. Now, her team, the people helping her, researched a lot of possible nonprofits in America. And then having researched them, they simply phoned them up out of the blue and they said, here, we want to give you a lot of money, do your best with it. And the grants that they gave not only did they not have an application form because people were phoned up, but the grants were large, so allowed for a lot of stuff to be done. They were long term, so people were not reapplying for money 5 minutes later. And really important, they were unrestricted and trusting in nature. They were not grants with many strings telling nonprofits, you must do this with the money and you mustn't do this with the money. And so despite the fact that these grants are stunningly enormous and the sort of thing that only kind of a billionaire can do, this kind of grant making is actually quite humble in practice.
Yeah, so the second value that we talk about is equity. I'm sure this won't surprise anybody today, as we're sort of, in some ways, finally starting to talk a lot more about equity in grant making specifically, and we're starting to see even more action here, although we would argue nowhere near enough at the moment. We actually agree with the analysis from John Ellerman Foundation Director Safina Ahmad, who we think puts the situation quite plainly. She told us, quote, there is a massive power and privilege imbalance that we have propped up and sustained, and if we're honest, sometimes enjoyed. We need to explore it if it's something that we've sort of liked or preferred or actually need to do something about and change, end quote. So one thing that's clear from the research we undertook when developing modern grant making is, as I say, there are numerous pushes going on in terms of trying to make grant making itself more accessible and equitable, but the sector, as a whole, is arguably decades behind where it should be, and there's still so much work left to be done. Probably lots of you know the stats around diversity on foundation boards. As of a couple of years ago, 99% of board members were white in the UK, for example. But maybe you might be less familiar with the sort of shocking findings from a survey conducted amongst grant makers, specifically by the Grant Givers Movement in 2018. In this survey, over 40% of respondents reported that they'd actually witnessed prejudice and discrimination inside funders firsthand. So, of course, the status quo needs to change. But what we found so inspiring when we were interviewing, so many different grant makers and nonprofit leaders for the book, is that we came across a huge number of individuals that are actually not just talking about things, but showing that, better is definitely possible, like Tom said. So, for example, we learned about the creation of really large, new, unrestricted funding streams that are co-designed with people from marginalised communities, where decisions are ultimately made by people from those communities. So the Democracy Frontlines Fund in the US is one example. It's an initiative launched in 2020 by a consortium of funders to provide sustained support to frontline Black activists leading the movement to end systemic racism. And it will commit $36 million in unrestricted funding to 10 Black-led grassroots organisations advocating for racial justice over the course of 3 years. Crucially, this group of grantees were selected by a brain trust, as they call it, of women of colour with deep experience funding social movements. So in short, it's an example of, funders really letting go of power and respecting sort of lived experience and needs of communities. We also spoke with grant makers in organisations where some funders are really trying to make a concerted effort to collect and use data in order to drive more equitable funding decisions and to sort of help make workplaces genuinely more inclusive. So in some cases, this meant funders recording, analysing and debating data, especially on who gets grant funding, who works in funders, but also who doesn't get grant funding, who drops out of the process or self-selects out, and who doesn't get hired as grant makers, and who might leave, actually, even if they've joined as a grant maker, because the workplace isn't actually as inclusive as maybe it was kind of branded. So the Funders Collaborative Hub's work on diversity, equity and inclusion, the data standard as it's known, is a relevant tool here, particularly when it comes to funding, and is something that our wonderful co-speaker Fozia has championed. So that might be something you want to check out. I will drop a link in the chat now, if so.
So that's the second of the 5 values. The third is evidence. So what does it look like in practice to be a grant maker who values evidence? Well, some of it's just incredibly simple. And what I mean by this is when, as a grant maker, you first assess a funding proposal, when it first comes in and you first look at it, grant makers should take the time to ask themselves the following incredibly simple question, which is there any evidence out there of the impact of initiatives like this? Now, those of you who are outside the grant-making world, people who are grant seekers and applicants, you might be stunned to know that this doesn't happen sometimes, that the reality of busy bureaucracies is, which is what a lot of funders are, is often funding proposals come in and people are so sort of busy and kind of harassed that they look at the funding proposal, but they don't go off, as it were, to find any other evidence. And you really have to. That's what it is to value evidence. Valuing evidence means also making changes that are more difficult than that extremely simple one that I just gave. So, for example, it is far too common today for a grant funding organization to ask a grantee, hey, would you make your own evaluation? Would you just like evaluate what you're doing and send us a report about whether or not it's working? Send us a progress report. Now, I don't know about you, but this, to me, and I speaking here as someone who both was a grant maker, but also who applied for a lot of grants and who had a lot of grant relationships. This is quite like asking a school pupil to just answer, to mark all their own homework and then send along the marks really honestly back to the teacher. It's like there are certain things there that don't quite add up. In practice, grant makers that value evidence, it means that they have to be willing to deploy money really differently, and in particular to deploy money to pay for independent evaluations of grants. So a third party who can make a reasonably sort of neutral assessment of whether or not something is working, and who doesn't have a massive conflict to say, oh, it's really working really well, or no, it's not working at all, but someone who will give a pretty honest answer. Is this a pain in the neck compared with the way of doing things in the past? Yeah, it sort of is. Is it also vital to live up to essential values? Yeah, it is as well. Gemma.
Thanks. So, fourth value, we argue that grant makers should value service. Now, service might seem like an odd choice of a value for our profession, since a funder obviously isn't a shop or a restaurant or whatever. But what we mean by this is that a grant maker should, or a grant maker that does value service, will be willing to be personally inconvenienced to make life better and easier for applicants and grantees. And this is in contrast to grant makers who think maybe grant seekers are lucky to even have a shot at their funding, and who prefer to arrange a system to make their lives easier than that of grant makers. So a service mindset forces us to remember that we actually, or grant makers, need grantees. They're our central partners, and that without them, funders may as well be as useful as a chocolate teapot. So in practice, valuing service also means listening to and learning from potential partners rather than nudging them into sort of your organization's agenda. It can also mean investing time and energy into redesigning your funding processes to make it better for grant seekers, not just convenient for you and your board if you have one. So one clear example of an individual grant maker demonstrating a service mindset is a grant maker who pushed their employer to make significant changes to their application process. So at the time, this funder worked in a very traditional way, only accepting long paper-based applications. But after meeting with the leader of a sort of new charity in the local area, the grant maker in question realized that their way of doing things was excluding people, including the leader of this charity who was autistic, and told the funder basically that I can't fill in your application form. Is there any way you can do in-person meetings and we can have a conversation and then make a decision after that? So after working with the leader of this new charity, the grant maker successfully pushed for this change, and the charity ended up receiving funds because they were a good fit, and paper-based applications became less common, and sort of digital online became more of the norm.
So finally, here's the fifth value that underpins modern grant making. We think that all grant makers need to value diligence. Now, here's a striking quote. This might make your blood boil, from a board member, must be said, of an unnamed private philanthropic foundation, quoted expressing their honest thoughts off guard. So, grant making is easy. I don't know why we even pay people to do it. Now, this attitude makes me and Gemma very cross, and especially because it offends the value of diligence. One of the worst, most deeply embedded problems with traditional grant making is that too many crucial, life-changing grant and strategy decisions are made by people, especially, it must be said, at the board level, who simply haven't put much time or effort into working on being a good grant maker. Now, these same people who think that it's all easy, just chuck money away, these people would be horrified if their own pension was managed by people who said, it's easy, I don't need to train, it's just like, it's just money, it's easy, isn't it? So diligence is a crucial virtue and of crucial value in grant making. Now, those of you who've bothered to turn up on this sunny afternoon here at the end of the working day, you are diligent. That's why you're here. You're showing it. But it is something that we have to value, and that is, if it's not there, causes a great problem. So back to Gemma.
Okay, so those are the 5 values that we argue underpin modern grant making: humility, equity, evidence, service, and diligence. We hope they help you to think about your own practice, whether as a grant maker or a fundraising professional. I think we're running a little bit over, so back to Jay before we get to hear from the amazing Fozia.
Okay, thanks, Jim and Tom. And that's a bit about the sort of some of the principles in the book, and hopefully we can get into some of the, as you call, the no-brainers, because as I said at the beginning, what's really great about this book is that it kind of translates practical actions that people can do to try to bring forward those principles. And we are going a little bit over, but I want to make sure we have plenty of time for Fozia to speak, and then questions and answers at the end. We've had a few questions in the Q&A, but in the interest of kind of making sure we get to the Q&A session, I think we'll try to handle those after Fozia does her bit. And so the question that we've got for you, Fozia, which you're welcome to answer or answer otherwise if you wish to, is what do you think grant makers' biggest reform priorities should be to maybe kind of get this kicked off?
Yeah, no, that's a really, really big question. And I think the biggest priority for me is moving grant makers from an equity position to a justice position. In the last few years, we have moved within the grant making sector from equality to equity, but now I think we need to move further on to looking through a prism of justice. And what justice is all about is looking at the context within which disadvantage and deprivation exists. So quite often you'll find a lot of grant makers, we deal with the symptoms. A lot of our funding goes towards projects where we're just dealing with the end result of, systemic issues. And what I think funders need to do in this country, which is happening in places like the US, is for funders to move further upstream and to say, okay, what is causing this issue? And to really look at systemic issues, to look at everything as a systemic concept. To look at history. Why are certain communities disadvantaged? Why are certain outcomes just not being reached for certain communities? And have that deeper knowledge and understanding of history, society, economics, housing, all of those interconnected factors which are part of why a person ends up in a place of deprivation or disadvantage. So rather than just treating the symptoms, we need to go back to the cause, and we need to start using a justice lens. So that's my next provocation to the grant making sector. Is brilliant. We've moved to equity. That was sort of one of my key ambitions a few years ago. Now I want to push us further along the spectrum to justice. And I think, because obviously Gemma and Tom talk about equity, which is brilliant in the book. The other thing that they talk about is evidence and diligence. And as a grant maker, I think every grant making organisation I've worked with, evidence and diligence has been really, really important. The question is, how do we define what good evidence is? How do we define what risk is? What does risk look like? And in my experience, diligence, good diligence, is equated with a long process. It almost feels sort of validating. If you've got a long process, by definition, that must mean that we've been very diligent. And actually, diligent means just about proportionality in what you're asking for. So that's a really, really key point for me. And in terms of risk, how do we define risk? In my experience, risk is defined in very certain, very particular ways. It's in a newly established organisation. It's an organisation which doesn't quite have full accounts, or they're just serving a very particular community which we don't know much about, or their safeguarding they haven't had really complex safeguarding training. All of these things that we put into place as minimum standards for organisations to be able to be funded. And I know from my own experiences of applying for funding that if you don't pass those minimum standards, you're very unlikely to get funding. So there's a question about how we define risk within an organisation. And the reason why that's so important is because if you look at the context of what's happening around us in the world today, it's not institutions creating the change. It's not the big, civic society organizations. It's young people. It's people who don't belong to a charity, who've never had a constitution, who just meet online and talk about what they want to do and build a movement. The Black Lives Matters movement, the Me Too movement, the climate change movement. This isn't work that traditional charities will apply to us for funding, but this is where there is so much momentum and energy. And I think for grant makers, we need to think about how do we become part of that movement, rather than trying to force that movement to fit into a model that suits us. Because unless we harness the potential of those movements, we're not going to really bring about social change. And at the end of the day, what all grant makers claim to want is social change, the eradication of poverty, the eradication of inequality. We cannot do that without harnessing the power of all these networks and new organisations and new ways of working, building movements which don't traditionally fit into our model. So I think that's where our reform is really, really needed. And I think one of the things that would really catalyse change is greater accountability. Foundations and grant makers, we have very little accountability generally, apart from in specific circumstances. So, for example, I work at Children in Need. We raise our funds through public fundraising, and so there is a level of accountability where we will, demonstrate what we're funding, how we're funding, and try and be quite transparent. But generally, within the foundation sector, if you're a private foundation or a family foundation, there isn't that scrutiny or accountability. But what the example that I have seen that has been really successful, where there has been a catalyst for change, is in California. So probably about 15 years ago now, a non-profit organisation called the Greenling Institute presented a bill to the Californian Assembly. And that bill would have required all the foundations in California to reveal their staff demographics and who their funding was being distributed, i.e. which communities. And it was the first time that foundations had been challenged in this way to say, actually, you're a foundation, you say you're here for public benefit, prove it, show us where your funding is being distributed, show us that the people in your organisation are representative of those communities and that your funding is being distributed equitably. Now, as you can imagine, there was a huge uproar in the foundation sector, and actually the bill was defeated. It never was passed. But what it did do was cast or shine a spotlight on foundations. And although the bill wasn't passed, subsequently a lot of foundations and grant makers started to publish data about where their funding was being distributed, what efforts they were making in order to make their staff and trustees more representative. So there was a public accountability in that way, or a scrutiny which catalysed the change. And I would say for charities, for people who are activists, that's the sort of accountability that starts to shift the dial within the sector. And that's where I think real reform can start to happen. So I shall leave it there, but I'm looking forward to chatting through this a bit more and answering some questions.
Thanks a lot. That's very thought-provoking. Thank you, Fawzia. The questions have been popping away while you've been talking, and I've been scribbling down loads of notes as well. I think when you talked about the proportionality of evidence, I think that's so crucial. In my opinion, there's a real danger. Although we need lots of better evidence, but there's a real danger of that becoming almost another sort of industry that winds up excluding lots of the organizations that we want to be the ones that we're bringing into the funding conversation. And there's a whole chapter about that actually in the book. And those questions about accountability, I was always thinking about, like, actually there's quite a lot of differences between the UK and the US in that respect, and we kind of tend to do this sort of transatlantic thing, which is really interesting to compare. But I think also the one thing we do have in this country, which maybe they've kind of been trying to build in different ways in different states in America, is the Charity Commission, and it doesn't really kind of offer that level of accountability, but it does offer a certain level of transparency, which I think is important. That's been part of DSC's sort of founding mission many years ago, was to put the activities of the grant makers up to greater scrutiny. So thank you so much for that. There's quite a lot of questions, and I don't want to take up any more time than is needed, so we can move to that. I'm just thinking about how to organize these, because they're a real diversity of different questions, and whether we can sort of group them a bit. I mean, we have 10 or 12 questions. We have quite a few about the sort of equity EDI related. We have some more about the relationship and trust. I think we also have some other quite interesting. Gemma, you've got a question. Did you want to offer a suggestion? You got your hand up. Was that for me?
No, I'm afraid I accidentally did that. Just to mess with you, Jay. Apologies. Yeah, you can throw the first question to me because of my poor tech skills.
All right, I'll try to go in sort of roughly in time order, since we've got more coming in all the time. So first question is from Nick Davis, which is about modern grant making in the public sector, where there should be open applications and considerable transparency, but it's not just so easy to phone people up and give them money without an application. How can we improve that?
Yeah, so I don't mind just going for that for a moment. I don't know why my hand is still up. I'm not constantly pressing it, so that might be up for the rest of the time. Sorry, okay. No idea. Yeah, I think that's a great question. One of the things that we say in terms of the book is that we feel it's relevant for all types of grant makers, so not just people that work for, like, private foundations or family foundations. And in my previous role as funding strategy director at the Community Fund, I worked a lot with public sector and public sector grant making, actually, in different ways. So I think a lot of the advice and suggestions are relevant. I do think, there are sometimes for public bodies and like quasi-public bodies, different levels of accountability and sort of paper trails that are expected. But I don't think that I would find it hard to believe that some of those things are justifications for not living up to the values that we talked about, and some of the no-brainers, for example. So I think that, if you have to have a certain type of process around procurement, for example, maybe the public body and the funder needs to be encouraged and challenged to think about that process. Because one of the things that people told us quite a lot when we were researching the book, including people that worked for central and local government in grant making roles and commissioning roles, was that processes just seem to accrete over time. And you just end up having this sort of like Byzantine arrangement that doesn't really serve anyone, certainly not people applying. So I think sometimes the processes that people have and maybe stand by could, serve to be shaken up a bit and changed. And what we need is people who are wanting to be sort of modern grant makers or are behaving like that within some of those institutions now, kind of really asking questions. Why do we have to have the process like this? Can it be redesigned? Can it be done differently?
Thank you, Gemma. Yes, it's very difficult, actually, sort of making change in the statutory sector because of all the different sort of red tape and kind of procedures that they have to follow. But my hope has always been that, kind of the better practice from the charitable sector or the lottery can bleed into that. But okay, so I'm just going to try to group a couple of other questions because they're on similar topics. We're getting more all the time, which is great. So I'm just navigating here. So there's some questions about risk, which you mentioned, Fozia, which is so important, and kind of openness and relationships. So I'll mention a couple of these, and maybe we can try to tackle them at the same time. Maybe this one might be for you, Tom. We're currently balancing the want to be open, trusting, and have a simple process with being diligent and having the paper trail from grantees. Is there any advice on how we can balance this? And then another one from Anonymous, which is saying that as an organization receives grants, I'm interested in the level of trust with the grant maker. I believe if the grant maker encourages honest evaluation, the idea that you need external evidence is not essential to not an essential requirement. Why not trust and value the grantee to learn together rather than create additional work? It must be proportionate. So can I throw those two to you, Tom?
Sure. I'll start with Eleanor's question. We're currently balancing the want to be open, trusting, and have a simple process with being diligent. The questions keep moving. That's an exciting feature. Now, I think that Fozia actually said something that really kind of hits the nail on the head here about the balance there between openness and diligence, or sort of heaviness and paperwork, which is that diligence does not mean, must not mean more process. Right? It's not more questions, more, please send us your inside leg measurement. Please send us your blood type. Please send us this. That's not diligence. When I witnessed incredibly diligent grant making inside of some of the organizations I work for, it involves stuff like very user-focused grant makers who did user research into what it was like to be an applicant. And then the diligence, the hours and weeks of time and energy was often spent like stripping away. It was spent doing things like discovering that of the 92 questions in our current enormously long application form, diligence allowed you to realize through a series of work and conversations that 36 of those questions no one cared about internally. The people who had put those 36 questions on the survey had all retired or died or never needed in the first place. And so diligence from a grant maker can often mean taking time and effort and energy and really, really thinking in a way that can then come over to a grant seeker as an incredibly light experience, an incredibly simple thing, a lack of paperwork. But Fozia is totally right that especially in public sector infused organizations, there can be a philosophy which is, don't read the paperwork, feel its weight, weigh it, because as long as it's nice and heavy, then that means we're never going to get ripped off. We're never going to make any mistakes. We're never going to get in trouble. And of course, that's completely untrue, because if you were to think about a big famous grant-making disaster like Kids Company or something, right? If you were to have gone back through all of the institutions there and found the paperwork bundles, you'd find massive, essentially kind of ass covering, paper trails. But that wasn't the same as genuinely digging, doing great research, asking really kind of the relevant questions. So the person who asked that question, it's brilliant. You're looking for openness and transparency, but don't let there'll be certain powers that be in your institution, possibly represented by the legal team or the finance team and stuff, that will be always attempting to say but what if we had another checkbox? Won't everything be safer and better if there's another checkbox and another question? And as a grant maker, your role is sometimes to go, no, actually, adding that checkbox, adding that question might make an 18-year-old applicant never apply. It might make the kind of informal applicant that Fozia was talking about, a group of people who've just come together and they're just thinking about their idea. They might look at your form, see the question that says 3 years of accounts, please, and give up and run away and never come to your money. And you need to push back and say, when we add bureaucracy, we take more risks. We maybe get rid of some fraud risk, but we actually, the addition of questions and paperwork is a way of increasing the risk that we only fund the kind of organizations we always used to fund. And as a piece of risk management, that ain't great. And of course, it's rubbish for equity and justice.
Can I just add something on there, which you touched upon, Tom, which was about monitoring and evaluation and evidence of impact. And I think that came up in the questions, but the questions are moving so fast I can't keep up. But there's something really, really fundamental that I think we need to think about as grant makers, which is that we always want evidence of change. Whatever it is, we want some sort of change. We want a direct link between our money and a change in something, whether it's somebody's outcomes, whatever it is, there needs to be a change. And a question that I think about is, what would grant making look like if we just funded the existence of things? Just the existence of a youth club where somebody feels safe and they're making relationships and they're getting connections, and it's a place where they're building their self-esteem. So just in of itself, the existence of that place is of value. But what we tend to do as grant makers is say, show me the change that my money has brought. And there's a real fundamental difference, because if you start from that place of just funding the existence and recognizing the value of existence of certain intangible things like connection, relationships, safe space, then your requirements about evidence and putting that burden about monitoring and evaluation will really, really just completely be transformed.
That there's just while we've got I'm going to try to as the panelists have been saying, this is like the kind of continually growing list, which is great. So I'm going to try to organize a couple, which I think I would like to direct to you, Fawzia, because you've been so eloquent about this. So there's two, I think, both from Anonymous, but one of them is, how can grant funders insist on EDI improvements or change when they're not complying with these principles? And then another one, which I think is related, is what are the barriers to better board diversity in the funding sector? You have a go at those?
Yeah, I think in terms of barriers to board diversity, there's a certain type of person who tends to become a trustee of a board, of a foundation. And you have to remember the historical context of many foundations, family foundations. There's some of them who can trace their history back to Victorian philanthropy, and there's that whole sort of benefactor, beneficiary mentality. And what was perpetuated was the tap on the shoulder. So the county set, the great and the good were tapped on the shoulder, and and that's how these positions were filled. And I think one of the most important things for me is open recruitment. So there's some really good initiatives now taking place where organisations and charities are trying to encourage much more diverse board membership. But there's a real interesting dynamic which needs to be tackled, and I've seen this and I've experienced this, where when I first became a trustee, and I was really, really reluctant to be a trustee, I just did not see myself as a trustee at all. I just wasn't in that space, and the dynamic when you join a board is almost as if you should be grateful that you've been allowed onto the board, and quite often it can feel tokenistic, ticking a box. And it's because of this dynamic of we're doing you a favour by letting you onto the board, rather than what the dynamic should be is about, we really value your skills as a person. We see something in you, whether it's your experience, your expertise, your qualifications, whatever it is, which will add so much value to our board. And the board need to recognise that they have a responsibility to people that they're bringing onto the board. It's not a question of, okay, we've recruited X number of diverse candidates, our job is done. When those candidates are recruited, they need a huge amount of relationship, building, hand-holding, guidance, mentoring, and it's the foundation's responsibility to do that. The person who's brought on board shouldn't have to ask for those things. So but there are very, very significant barriers, and I think targeting specific communities, recognizing that there are historical reasons why people don't put themselves forward, cultural reasons, educational reasons, etc., and then specifically targeting those groups in a way which is appropriate and relevant, I think is really important. And I've forgotten your first question.
We're going to go back and find it.
Oh, I know. It's about how can grant makers talk about DEI when there's such a huge lack of representation. And I think that's a really valid point. And I think that's part of the reasons why there is now some change within the sector, because there is a recognition. And with the DEI Coalition, it's a group of 15 funders, including all the major ones, National Lottery, Comic Relief, and some smaller ones, coming together and recognising that actually our DEI, we don't have DEI frameworks, and it's an effort to try and implement the DEI framework in grant making, but also in the way that they are as an organisation. And my hope with that coalition is that over 2 years now, they've been working on trying to implement DEI frameworks. And I'm hoping that there will now be a ripple effect. And I see this already because I do get so many questions. And there's a website, deicoalition.com, where any foundation can go and look at the resources and say, okay, well, how do I translate this into how it looks for me? But I would say it's a work in progress. And I think everyone is perfectly entitled to ask those questions of foundations, particularly if there are foundations that you're applying for and they're asking you for data or for evidence. You're completely entitled to write back and say, that's great, I can answer those questions, but also, what are you doing about this?
What can you tell me about your own data and your own characteristics? I mean, that's something that Tom mentioned when we were discussing before the event, is oftentimes it can feel a little bit as the grant seeker that you're in a bit of a powerless position. But if we're going to make change in this area, I think we also have to start kind of pushing back and asking those questions back and saying, you're not showing any evidence of your own leadership being diverse, or your application process is terrible. So maybe that's something that the others can comment on. We've got a zillion questions, and I'm really afraid we're not going to get to them all. We've got about 10 minutes left. I'm wondering if I can suggest that the panelists, if people need to leave at 5:30, we could stick around a little bit and try to answer them in the chat if we don't happen to get to them in the kind of oral discussion. I think I will try to take us in a little bit of a different direction with some of the questions that we've been receiving. But just give me 2 seconds to, we've talked a lot about evidence, and we haven't talked quite so much about risk, because I think there was a question about that, which is quite important. We did talk about trust. Quite a lot of questions also about, Fozia, your point about moving upstream and the balance between dealing with the root causes of problems, but still the symptoms being around and possibly even getting worse.
Yeah, and it's not a question of either or. There's this typology of foundations where some are stabilizers, some are transformers, and some are modernizers. There is a place for foundations and grant makers to just fund frontline service provision to treat those symptoms, because those symptoms are not going to go away, within the next generation or so. So it's not a question of either or. There will always be foundations, and I think to some extent, Children in Need is one of those. We will always fund large volume, broad-based, very open access provision. We're now starting to do more strategic work, which is looking at some of those issues in a bit more depth. But to a large extent, we will always do that type of work, and I would imagine National Lottery, etc. will. Then there are foundations like Lankelly Chase, Barrow Cadbury, who are the sort of the transformers. They're the ones who are fighting systems change, who are funding advocacy, campaigning. Joseph Rowntree, their anti-poverty agenda is a really good example. So I think we need that breadth of some foundations doing the systems change work, and some doing that broad open access provision. But I think I don't think there's enough foundations doing that systems change work. If you look at the amount of resource that is needed to campaign, to lobby, to change narratives, it's really staggering.
Yeah, if you don't mind, there's another book author, Phil Buchanan's an American grant-making specialist, runs the Center for Effective Philanthropy, and he wrote an extremely entertaining book called Giving Done Right. And in it, he talks about the fact there's a certain snobbery when people discover that you can either spend your grant-making money on basically preventing harms, or you can spend your grant-making money on kind of sort of scooping up when the harms happen and sort of saving people. And what he's really good at pointing out is that everyone who thinks themselves to be a little bit clever tends to kind of be drawn towards the idea that prevention is somehow it, and that spending money on prevention is it, and spending money on picking up the pieces is like just sort of rubbish for sort of like the little people. And he's really good on the fact that that is actually not really a form of like cleverness. It's like fake cleverness. It's actually just a kind of arrogance, because it's a bit like saying the NHS should really just shut down all its emergency rooms and just have vaccines. Because if we had enough vaccines, no one would ever end up in an emergency room. And that is so manifestly untrue. It makes you realize that from a grant-making perspective, all grant makers should always be, as Fozia was saying, should be thinking, where do we fit in an ecosystem of funders that worry about everything between spending money on preventing things at the earliest possible stage, and then ultimately flying in sacks of rice and flying in clean water when there's been a volcano and has blown up the town, right?
There's also, I think, a sort of broader challenge and question for foundations, which is sort of the norm at the moment is that many foundations work in perpetuity, i.e. many of them are endowed and they spend a fraction, a slice of that endowment every year, and they will just exist until things change so much that that's not possible. And I think there's a bigger question there, particularly when it comes to movement building and funding and some of the crises that we're experiencing at the moment, for funders to say, actually, is that right? Because for many funders, in my experience, that question isn't really ever asked. If they're set up to fund in perpetuity, they will, but that doesn't always mean that they have to, depending on how they were initially formed. So I do think, we interviewed Pia Infante, who co-runs the Whitman Institute, for our book, and they were proponents of something called trust-based philanthropy. And the reason I mention it is because they went through an interesting process to move to what's known as a spend-down foundation, because they felt that was right for them and their mission and their way of working. So when we're talking about prevention versus kind of existing needs, there's also something about, well, foundations, some of them are sitting on huge amounts of money. Sometimes I think the strategic choices for that are questionable.
And as your book discusses, also the I think slowly emerging questions around what those endowments are invested in and how they're used and how they're deployed, and how that can support sort of various upstream kind of social change, I think is something that's really important. I think we've talked about a lot of the really big questions, which is awesome, and we could absolutely go on forever doing that. But I wonder if we could, in the time left, we've got just drill down a little bit into some of those no-brainers, because the presentations were a little bit less about that. And there's a question, I think, which is related to this. From Carl Richardson, what does the panel think about platforms like Brevio that attempt to standardize applications, and grant makers can set out their key criteria with a view to matching and greater chances of success for funders and grantees? How can we, can you talk a bit more about how do grant makers change their systems to make it more effective for people and more accessible and inclusive? Who wants to take that one?
So Gemma, do you want to do? Both Gemma and I have spent quite a lot of our lives doing this, but I don't want to hog the mic. Gemma?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's quite a lot in there, Jay, for 1 minute, but okay. Yeah, so Brevio, I must confess, I'm aware of Brevio. I've looked at the interface, but I don't honestly know how many funders at the moment are signed up and how it's being used. So I feel like I couldn't give you an honest answer there. I do think that, as you say, there's Brevio platform amongst others, which are trying to encourage funders to kind of allow charities and other kinds of organizations to share their needs and their information rather than having to do something that's bespoke every time. So I like the principle of it. For me, jury's out just in terms of how it works, in terms of its intention. I don't know enough. I need to learn more. How you can make your funding more accessible. Let's talk about accessibility just very briefly for a moment. One major issue is that some funders don't have any website at all, and many funders have a completely inaccessible website that people with certain types of disabilities or conditions just can't use it. So that, for me, is just unacceptable and should be changed. And even the smallest foundations and funders have enough money to redo their website, getting advice and support from disabled people and other people who can inform them on accessibility. So that's my one thing about that. And when it comes to sort of online application forms and other materials, if you design your website accessibly, then also you can make sure that those things are equally as accessible. And then finally, for me, some of you might have heard of hashtag Fix the Form, the recent campaign that's been particularly here and in the States that was encouraging funders to sign up with the pledge that they will make, if they have an application form, all of those questions visible up front. That was the sort of main pain point that people had shared in advance. And I think that's an example of a brilliant kind of practical movement. And I think it's kind of how, if we are passionate about that, how do we support that? How do we keep pushing it? 100 funders is great, but there's just thousands upon thousands. And, showing your questions is great, but then what if you show your questions and your website isn't accessible?
Any of you who happen to be going to the Association of Charitable Foundations yearly conference, which I imagine some of you are, you'll actually find Gemma and I are going to be there specifically on running a session on how can really small funding organizations that can't afford 10 design experts to make everything really great, what sorts of things you can do there. And so if that is something that is on your mind, then consider coming along to that, or just drop us a mail as well.
Okay, unfortunately, I think that's all we've got time for. Thank you for all of your questions, and a huge apologies if we haven't been able to answer them all. We probably needed at least an hour and a half, but we'll bear that in mind for next time. And we'll take a look at those questions and see if we can find a way to at least give a little bit of answer in the chat, which you can maybe then refer to later. Thank you so much for attending, and thank you very much to our panelists. I had a really great time today with you all, and welcome, and please come again.
Thanks everybody, take care.
Thank you very much.